Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. This is Natural Pregnancy and Birth. Um, and today we're going to be talking about something that comes up a lot during pregnancy, switching care providers. And yeah, so my name is Atara, and Tori, you have some experience with this. So let's start at the very beginning. At some point during your pregnancy, you switched providers. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, so I actually changed providers twice throughout my pregnancy. When I first got pregnant, I just went to the hospital that I normally went to and kind of like looked through their OBGYNs and picked one out because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. And I had one friend at the time that I kind of asked who she had used in the practice and what she thought of the doctors, but that was about all the thought that I gave to it because it just felt like that was what you were supposed to do. And so I went there for the first 20 weeks, 19 weeks. And I think I had like 4 or 5 visits in that span of time. And I saw the doctor once for like maybe 5 minutes. And I just had a moment where I was like, I don't even know the person that's going to be there when I give birth. And the way their practice was set up, like many practices, is that if you go in after hours to give birth, you get whoever is on call. You don't necessarily get your doctor. And like I said, I'd only met my doctor once. I didn't know any of the other doctors that were in the practice. And some of them were male, about half of them were male. And that just wasn't what I wanted. And the longer that I was pregnant and the more I thought about the birth that I actually wanted, the more I realized that that just wasn't it for me. And so I had another friend who was a doula, and we had talked often because when I initially got pregnant, I was really scared of birth. I was scared of what it entailed. I felt like I didn't know a whole lot about it. It just seemed like this really scary thing that was portrayed in the media as painful and unpredictable and life-threatening maybe. And so I talked with her often because she just had this love of birth that was intriguing to me because it didn't seem like something that you would love from my understanding of it. And she gave me some really great resources and books to read that really shifted my thinking on it. And she also introduced me to the local birth center in the town where I was living in. That I didn't even know it was there when I initially got pregnant. And so I switched my care at 20 weeks to that birth center, and I was seeing the midwives there. And I just felt so much better about it that my appointments were longer, that I saw the midwife for the whole appointment. And like they made sure that you rotated through and saw all the midwives. When you went into labor, you knew that midwife. And I just felt really great about it. I was really excited about giving birth in the birth center and, giving birth with a midwife instead of an OB. And then when I was 30-ish weeks pregnant, my husband and I kind of had an epiphany of sorts that we would really like to be closer to family to raise our baby. And at the time we lived about 4 hours across the state from both of our families. And so we decided that we wanted to move back. And I told him that I thought it was better to move back pregnant than it was with a newborn. I wasn't totally sure, but I thought that that seemed better. And so we started looking for a house. We put our house on the market, and it was just like a whirlwind. And part of that whirlwind was changing my OB to somebody back in our hometown. And I think that that was the piece about moving that I felt the most nervous about. I was so happy where we were, and our hometown is like population 8,000, and there's nothing here like a birth center or something natural like that. There's just one clinic / hospital. It's all in one building. It's very small. And so I was really nervous initially. But I have a really good doctor here. She's the doctor that was my pediatrician growing up. She's my mom's doctor. And I really like her. And so I traveled back once, and I had a conversation with her about what birth would look like here. And at the time, it felt like she was flexible. You know, she was open to the different things that I wanted to do, like not giving birth on my back or not having an epidural. And it seemed like it went really well. So we moved back. I was 34 weeks maybe when we moved back, and started seeing her there. So yeah, that's kind of how I picked each of the different doctors that I saw.
Gotcha. So what I'm what I'm hearing is that there was even though you were familiar with the doctor in the town that you moved back to, there was still like a very big difference in care that you were receiving from the midwives that you originally planned to at the birth center to give birth to.
Yeah, I think there was just a big difference in the setting, because I definitely think that she is more of a small town doctor. I saw her every appointment. We talked for probably half an hour at every appointment. It wasn't like that big city hospital that I saw my doctor once for 5 minutes. So that issue was definitely better, but I think that also because it's a small town, people are a little more closed-minded to things. So they kind of just go by the book and go by the hospital policies. And I didn't realize going in quite how much that would influence her decisions as well. So the doctor itself was great. I think that it was even more the fact that it was a hospital setting that really influenced the care that I received. And I think the hard thing is just at the end of the day, like, the closest birth center to where I live is about 2 hours away across state lines. So it was kind of a situation where I felt like I had to make the best of what I had. There wasn't really another good option that I could see at the time.
Okay. So I guess my next question is, were you satisfied with the care that you were now receiving?
At the time I was. I think before I gave birth, I was happy with each of my checkups. I felt like I was receiving good care there. She was really open to talking about whatever questions that I had, whatever concerns that I had. I felt like she prepped me really well for, you know, like how to look for Braxton Hicks, what real contractions looked like, when to come to the hospital, what to pack to come to the hospital. So we talked a lot, and I felt well prepared. I felt well taken care of throughout my final pregnancy appointments.
Good. And you did mention it a bit earlier. You were talking about some of the things that you preferred, like your birth plan. Did your OB, did she honor the things that you wanted in your birth plan? Wanted or didn't want?
Yeah, so I think part of my in retrospect, one of the mistakes that I made was not having a birth plan that was like written out or typed out, or like very visual in a way. Because I think that it would have helped me stick to my guns and what I wanted for me, because I think where I really struggled was after I was admitted to the hospital, after I had been laboring for a while, and I had told the nurses when I first went in there that I didn't want an epidural. I just wanted to be up and around. And they were okay with that. didn't really affect them. So they were like, whatever. And I started laboring. I went to the hospital at like midnight one night. So I didn't actually see my doctor until she came in the next morning at 8, which was fine. You know, I just labored throughout the night, and it went okay. But like as the contractions became more intense, the nurse that I had, she was very kind, but she at one point looked at me, and I told her about 3 times that I did not want an epidural. And she looked at me and she said, "Can I ask why you don't want an epidural?" Like it was a really strange thing that I didn't want one. And I said, "Well, I think that it makes you more likely to tear, and it can stall your labor." And I said, I'd rather not have one. But at the time I was in quite a bit of discomfort, a bit of pain. And she kind of like looked at me afterwards and she's like, I've never heard those things before. She says, everybody tears here. It's just part of it, you know, and there's no, and I was like, well, I don't know about that. I said, that's not great. And but at the time I remember thinking when she asked me that question that like my brain was foggy because I was in active labor, and like trying to think through the logical reasons why I didn't want to have an epidural was like, I felt like I was in a fog trying to use my prefrontal cortex to like come up with these answers. And so I think like having a doula there with me would have made a world of difference in a moment like that. To just say like, it really doesn't matter why I just don't. And to give me alternative natural pain remedies. Because even before birth, I had taken a birth class, and like that's a huge part of it was natural pain management methods. But when you're in labor, it's hard to like remember and think of those things that you practiced to do. And you know, my husband did it with me, but my husband was kind of like, I mean, it was like the middle of the night, we'd been up all night. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and that was just one of the things with the nurse that was just different than what I wanted. And eventually I did give in. I got an epidural about 5 hours before I gave birth, just because I didn't feel like I had enough support to do it without. At that point I felt not defeated, but just like kind of defeated. And another thing with the hospital that I didn't know going into it was I knew that they had a tub that you could labor in. You couldn't give birth in it because it wasn't big enough, but you could labor in it. And so I was really excited about that because I really thought that I had wanted a water birth, but it just wasn't possible there. But while I was laboring, it was part of their hospital policy that you could labor in the tub whenever you wanted, but you had to get all the way out, back into the room, back into your hospital gown, and have the baby checked every hour. And it was just like a whole process when, you know, I was in the middle of contractions and I really just wanted to stay in the water because it helped so much. And they wouldn't let me do that. So yeah, and then I did end up giving birth on my back because I had an epidural. I pushed for like an hour and a half, and I did tear, and it felt like in retrospect it was just all these things, all these like inventions and little things that kept happening that ended up making it a not what I had anticipated or expected. And then like the next day I felt like my postpartum recovery was just a lot more difficult because of those. And that like, yeah, I did tear. I did have a 2nd-degree tear that I was recovering from. I was like sore in my arms from the way that they had me pushing. Like I was pulling myself up to push on my back. And So yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of things that kind of like snowballed and made it into an experience that wasn't what I wanted. But once we were like on that track, and once you're, 7 centimeters dilated and really in the labor process, it's harder to advocate for yourself at that point. So that's where I think just the hospital protocols and policies kind of crept in and really influenced my birth process.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. And there is something that I have noticed, and it's that, there's so many appointments up until the point that you give birth. However, it seems as though when you're in the thick of it, like when you're in labor, that's when a lot of questions that really should have been, a lot of things that should have been discussed prior to the birth. Like, for example, like you didn't want the epidural and you had to spend time during your labor and active labor explaining to the nurse, why you didn't want this intervention. And, just kind of makes you think on, you're like, I had all these appointments, you know what I mean? And now I'm in the process of labor and I have to take time to, explain this. And I don't want to speak for you, but like what I'm hearing, it's like it's a little bit insensitive to you as the woman who's giving birth. But and another thing you mentioned, you talked about how during the labor process you were in the birthing pool, and that's an area that you were comfortable in, and then there was a process of having to get out, and which really wasn't convenient for you, but it was more convenient for the providers. So I appreciate you sharing that. For women because there are a lot of women who have to switch for a lot of different reasons, and I know that yours was primarily like because you wanted to be closer to family, but some women switch late in pregnancy because they're not satisfied with the care, or for whatever reason, or maybe they have a big move. But what advice do you have for women who want to switch providers?
Yeah, I think because I switched for both reasons at different points in my pregnancy, I can speak to both. And I think for that woman that is wanting to switch because she's not satisfied with her care, I felt that too. And I felt really apprehensive about switching, even though it was just in the middle of my pregnancy. But I also felt a lot of pressure that like it wasn't the right decision, and that it was different than what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to give birth with an OB, and I wanted to go a very different route, and having a midwife and being at a birth center, that's different than what you're supposed to do. And what would people think of me if that's what I picked instead? And I remember being really nervous to tell my mom too, because like I wanted her to know that I was still picking what I thought was best for me and for our baby. And I think there's kind of this stigma around it that it's not as safe for mom and baby, and that the statistics show that's actually the opposite of true. But at the time, I felt really concerned with people thinking that I was not making the best choice. And after I made the switch, I felt so much better. It felt like a weight was lifted off of me. I felt excited to go to my appointments instead of dreading them. I felt excited to give birth instead of dreading it. And it just made such a huge difference in my mental health, how I was feeling about birth, how I was feeling about the pregnancy. Once I got past that initial like nervousness and fear, it was so, so good for me. And then moving for logistics, I think the advice that I would have would be multiple things. Because one, I felt like I did the advice that people always give, and saying like, have a conversation about what you want and have a conversation about, you know, what their protocols are, what to expect and whatever. And I felt like I had that conversation. And I felt satisfied with all her answers at the time. So like what I would go back and do differently is, one, I would have a written birth plan that I took with me to the hospital. And so like this would be more advice too that I would give for women that are having a birth in the hospital versus in a at home or in a birth center or things like that, because I think that that would have made a lot of difference if I had a written thing that I could refer to, refer the nurses to. If I would have included like natural pain management things for like my husband to refer to while I was in labor, like I think that would have made a big difference, because I think when you switch providers, it's not just about the provider that you're switching to, it's about the facility that you're switching to. Like I said, I think that's what made the biggest difference for me. So I would say, you know, have a written birth plan. Even though I think it would have been strange, the nurses would have looked at me weird. I wish I would have had a doula there. I think that's something that's like unheard of here, but it would have made a huge difference for me. So even if it's not something that's typical in your birth setting, to look into having a doula, and just have things in place that help you advocate for yourself and advocate for the birth that you want. And that you have that support so that you're not having to do it all for yourself while you're in labor.
Right. And that's great advice. You had mentioned when you made the switch the first time, you had mentioned that you just felt better overall, like in terms of your mental health and all of that. And so something that I've realized is that a lot of women, you know, like you talked about, you're like, I don't feel like I'm supposed to be doing this. This goes against the norm. But there's like this misconception that, you know, the only thing that matters is a healthy baby. But that's not the only thing that matters. What also matters is your well-being, your mental health, and how you're feeling during the process of not just pregnancy, but labor as well. And so I appreciate you mentioning that, because that's a very important aspect of motherhood as well. And you mentioned something else. You talked about you talked about the location or the facility, and also the provider, and how those things are really important. You kind of can't really separate the two. Like you have to be comfortable with both. And so thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, just one thought I had about what you just said is that, you know, I wanted to be in a mentally healthy place when I gave birth, and birth was something that I was really excited for in that middle period when I was with the midwives. I had read like Ina May's book, and all the birth stories in it just sounded wonderful. And it was an experience that I was really excited for. And like personally, I think I'll only have 1 or 2 kids. I knew it was something I would only do once or twice in my life. And it was something that I really wanted to be a special experience. And I think that I felt a lot of sadness afterwards, that almost no part of it felt like that to me. No part of it did I feel like I was in tune with my baby and in tune with my body and being able to labor how I wanted to labor. So while we did both come out of it healthy, we both came out of it okay. It's an experience that I can't get back, and that I didn't get to experience how I wanted to, or as fully as I wanted to. And that's something that I can't change now, which has been something that's difficult to grapple with, and feel a lot of feelings about that. Like the world does tell you that if you both come out of it healthy, you should just be okay with however it happened. Especially moms that end up in a C-section scenario or something like that. You ended up okay, so you should be fine with it. And then that's just not the case. There's a lot of emotions that come with not getting the birth experience that you wanted. And even though I wouldn't say that my experience had birth trauma in it for me, it still wasn't what I wanted. And that's still something that I've emotionally had to work through, that I didn't get to have this experience with my baby that I wanted to have. So I think those women should really know that those feelings are valid, and that they are something that takes time to work through.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I really hope that those who are watching, I know that it's typical to, according to online data, it says that, people typically stop switching from 36 weeks to 38 weeks. But it's not uncommon for women to make switches at like 39, 40 weeks pregnant. So if for whatever reason, whether you have to move or whether, you're not satisfied with the care that you're getting, or maybe you just want something different, that it's really, really, really important to do the research and look into what is available to you. So thank you so much, Tori, for sharing your experience. I really appreciate it. And I hope that this is helpful to those who are watching. And if you're watching from YouTube, if you found this video to be helpful, then subscribe, and we'll continue to make more content like this. All right. Thanks, Tori.
Thanks for having me.